Gunsmithing the 1911 Fire Control Group. For many, the prospect of performing your own work on unknown systems seems too daunting to undertake. For this reason, many choose to hire out such work to those who claim to be experts in their field. However, with just a little bit of research and a willingness to perform outside their comfort zone, anybody can do it, regardless of the subject. When dealing with things like firearms, lots of folks are not willing to tinker with the internal mechanisms for fear of causing irreparable damage. However, with a little guidance and a little chutzpah, you too can perform hundreds of dollars worth of performance enhancement work for pennies. The most commonly requested upgrade for race guns is trigger work, shortening trigger travel, reducing creep, lightening trigger pull, over travel adjustment, spring tuning, etc., all of which can be achieved by either replacement of parts or by tuning the existing parts depending on the type of firearm being tuned and the requested work. Considering the gold standard for modern race guns is based on the 1911 design, this is the basis upon which we will explore methods for trigger tuning. Before delving into the details of how to tune a fire control system of 1911, it behooves the audience to understand how the system functions. The ingenious thing about the trigger system of the 1911 is how the parts are designed to be reliable, safe, and lend themselves to a very high performance standard all at the same time. The trigger in the 1911 is unique compared to most modern firearms in multiple ways, but the most obvious way is the linearity of the trigger travel. Most triggers rotate, 1911 slide. Much like that. The trigger is attached to a trigger bar, which slides back and applies pressure to the bottom of the disconnector. The disconnector then transfers the pressure to the bottom of the sear, one of only two parts that rotate in the fire control group. Once the sear starts to rotate, it disengages the sear surface between the hammer hooks located at the bottom of the hammer and the nose of the sear. Upon disengagement, the hammer strikes the firing pin and ignites the round in the chamber, firing the gun. The first method for reducing the trigger pull weight is the reduction of friction occurring between metal-to-metal contact surfaces. This can be achieved by polishing metal mating surfaces to an extremely high polish, commonly by the use of jeweler's paste. All of the parts associated with the fire control group should have all their surfaces polished to an extremely high gloss, no exceptions. The caveat here comes when polishing the sear nose and hammer hooks. They must be polished without adjusting the sear angle or taking the hooks out of square. The next method for reducing trigger pull weight has to do with the angles in which the sear nose is cut and the hammer hooks are trimmed. The concept here is to remember that the sear angle is set in respect to how the hammer hooks rest upon the sear. As you can see here and here. With too steep an angle on the sear nose, the hammer hooks will no longer be held at bay by the pressure of the mainspring, which applies rotational pressure to the hammer, and will overcome the resistance of the sear. This phenomenon is known as hammer fault and is incredibly unsafe. Too steep a sear angle, also known as negative sear engagement, is the defining characteristic of a bad trigger job and will require refitting of the sear to the hammer by a competent person. If the sear nose is cut at too shallow of an angle, also known as positive engagement, the rotation of the sear by the disconnector is hampered by the hammer hooks, causing the mainspring pressure to stack its resistance along with the resistance of the sear spring, causing a heavy trigger pull. Heavy triggers are not always a bad thing. They're very safe, but also make a firearm inherently hard to fire accurately. The goal is to achieve a neutral angle between the sear nose and the hammer hooks. This is achieved by making the sear surface perpendicular to the center of the pin upon which the sear rotates. Once the correct angle has been cut, polish the surface with a very hard, fine-grained stone. The trim length and angle of the hammer hooks will determine how long the sear engagement feels. To obtain a short, crisp trigger break, square the hammer hooks, polish them with the same fine stone from the sear polish, and cut the hooks to no less than 18 thousandths of an inch, 20 thousandths for those who do not wish to have a hair trigger. After the hooks have been squared, trimmed, and polished, take the polishing stone and break the bearing edges of the hooks. This will eliminate the gritty feeling of stock triggers. Now that all the parts have been prepped, it's time to tune the springs. The two springs associated with the fire control group of a 1911 are the mainspring, which applies rotational force to the hammer via the hammer strut, and the leaf spring, which has 3 legs, 2 of which were carried out. The leaf spring's left and center legs apply pressure to the sear and disconnector and trigger respectively. Adjust the sear leaf to apply a 1.5 pound resistance, and adjust the disconnector trigger leaf to 1 pound of resistance. This will require the use of a trigger scale, which can be purchased from nearly any online gun retailer. When tuning the mainspring, it's easiest to cut off a single length out of the bottom of the spring, but springs of full length are available for purchase. Either way, the goal here is to reduce the spring weight to around 20 pounds from the stock 23 pounds. It's important to keep in mind that the goal here is not to reduce all of the spring pressure, but to lessen it only slightly. The majority of the reduction of pull weight comes not from the lessening of spring pressures, but from the reduction of friction from the moving parts and the adjusting of the searing surfaces so the parts under spring pressure do not add their tensions together when the trigger is pulled. Each part requires its own weight to work properly, but the enhancement of the fire control system occurs when the spring pressures no longer impede each other and are no longer impeded by collateral friction. With the reduction of friction and the rebalancing of the appropriate springs, a high-quality race-ready trigger can be had with little investment and at great savings to you, the consumer. Now you're ready to make a name for yourself as one of the finest trigger tuners on the gunsmithing market.